Evening. Thanks for being here. My name's Adam Davis. I'm with Oregon Humanities. Before we do anything else, can we say a big hometown welcome to Eli Saslow, please?
Thank you. Very kind. Thanks. Thank you.
So you saw, I think many of you are here because you read Eli's writing in the New York Times, or you've read books he's written, or maybe you know him personally, or maybe you're very interested in the issues that he covers. And I want to just give a little background to the series this is a part of, let you know what the shape of the evening is, ask you a couple questions to help Eli get a sense of the room, and then we'll dive in. So this series is the program is called Consider This, and the theme for the year is fear and belonging. So we're thinking a lot about fear and belonging in a lot of different contexts. And Eli, your work, especially on the challenges around, I think, cities, the challenge that many cities are facing, seem to raise questions about both fear and belonging. And that's one of the reasons we're really excited to have you here to talk about this. We're going to take a chunk of time talking, the two of us, and then we're going to invite you to ask questions from over there. We also have a group of people watching this from LeGrand, and hoping we're going to get some questions from LeGrand, and thank you to the folks from LeGrand and elsewhere around that are piping in online. I want to say a couple thanks to the organizations that have made this event possible. And so the National Endowment for the Humanities, United We Stand, Connecting Through Culture Initiative, the Oregon Cultural Trust, Closer to Home, Tonkin Torp, The Standard, the Susan Hammer Fund of the Oregon Community Foundation, and then the City of Portland's We Are Better Together program. So a big thanks to all of those organizations for helping make this possible. Couple questions for you. Please respond with noise. No thrown objects. If this is your first Oregon Humanities Consider This event, could you make a little noise? If you're a returner, could you make a little noise? Okay, that's pretty close. Pretty close. Welcome to all of you. If what you do, if your activity in the world has something to do with the conditions and future of this city, could you make a little noise? Okay. Last question. If you have in your head a very clear plan for how to solve the biggest challenges.
Come take my microphone, if you do, please.
If you have that clear plan in your head, could you make some noise? Okay.
We have somebody, finally.
Okay, so there's one or two people with a clear plan. So, okay, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense, people that care a lot about the city, people that are involved with its future, and also people that didn't make a lot of noise about the clear plan for solving the range of challenges that we might have in front of us. And I should just say that many people here, my sense is, are quite involved with what this city is and what it might become. What I'd like to do actually is start by asking you, a few months ago you wrote a story about based in Portland and following one man who I actually was just lucky to meet, and that's Michael Bach. And I want to ask you, this may be funny to ask with Michael here, but I want to ask you, who is Michael Bach, and why, in thinking about a story about Portland, did you write a story following Michael very closely for a time?
Sure, and apologies in advance for maybe a long step-down answer. But first off, thanks so much for being here and doing this. Thank you to all of you for coming. I know that all of us, except for one person, don't necessarily have all the solutions. But I do think that one first major step towards solutions in any community is engaging and deciding that you want to think about it, be proactive about it, be a part of investing yourself in helping people and in bettering the place where you live. And I think coming to things like this is a part of that. So thanks for giving us some of your time. Thanks. So I guess the long step down to Michael, who's here, so I can't lie. So my main work is I'm a journalist. I write these longer stories now for the New York Times. And what I write about is how the major pressure points in the country, the big issues that we're facing in the United States, how they impact people's lives. There's no way to do that job and do it well in the last 3 or 4 years since the pandemic without writing about what's happened to many American cities, not just Portland, but cities all over the country, and I would say particularly west of the Mississippi. Many of them are struggling from some of the same endemic issues. It's a rise in unsheltered homelessness, more people who are not only homeless, but who are not living in shelters or staying in extended stay motels, but instead are out on the street. It is also like extremely high vacancy rates in downtowns. It's kind of like a vacuum in a lot of downtowns. And what's filled into that vacuum are people in huge states of distress, rising mental health crises, and reduced capacity for cities to respond to them, particularly because fentanyl, the worst opioid that we have seen in a series of horrific opioids, has become the major driver of so much disaster in Portland and a lot of other places. And in Portland, as all of us know in some ways, these crises, I would say, a wide-ranging mental health crisis that was exacerbated by the pandemic, a lack of affordable housing as housing prices have continued to skyrocket, fentanyl, which sells on the street often for 50 cents for a blue pill of fentanyl. These problems have sort of broken some of the basic civic structures of Portland and many other cities. In Portland, in our worst moments, our 911 call volume is at historic highs. The wait times have increased by drastic amounts. We have now still, I think, fewer than 300 patrol officers, police officers who are patrolling the city and trying to respond to this record number of 911 calls. We don't have enough ambulances, so that there are hundreds of calls every month to 911 where there is no ambulance now available to respond. Firefighters have essentially stopped being able to fight fires all the time because they are fighting the overdose epidemic. Fire Station 1 in downtown Portland, in 1 month last summer, responded to 300 overdoses. That is what they do. That's their job. That's the major part of what they do during their days. And we also have, in downtown in particular, a lot of small businesses that feel like all of these problems have arrived at their doorstep and they don't quite know what to do. And because when they call 911, they're on hold or they're routed to a non-emergency line where sometimes your wait time might be 4, 5, 6 hours, all of these businesses and all of these institutions around cities are looking for solutions. And one of those major solutions, and it is an imperfect solution for sure, is a massive growth in private security companies. If you're a coffee shop in downtown Portland at this point, you almost definitely have at least one private security contract and often two. The number of private security officers working every day in downtown Portland outnumbers police officers or law enforcement by about a rate of 8 to 1. And that's typical of a lot of cities in the West. One of the challenges with this is that private security guards, no matter how much they want to do, are necessarily limited by the law and sometimes also don't know how to provide the solutions that are needed, right? Private security guards writ large, it requires much less training than becoming a police officer or a firefighter. And also, they are not allowed to make arrests if they don't witness a crime. There are many things that they can't do. So nonetheless, in Portland now, in many cases, the first responders to overdoses, to people in crisis, to people in any kind of distress, the first people to get there are private security guards. And so that's what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about what it meant for America's cities that this industry has grown so much. And I also wanted to write about the people who are doing those jobs. And so I began talking to a lot of people in Portland, to a lot of different private security companies. There are more than 100, many more than 100, that do private security in downtown Portland on any given day. Some of them are sort of maybe the way we would think of private security. They're almost, as Michael, who's here, told me, they function almost more as scarecrows. It's companies that hire somebody to stand at the door, don't interact with people, but essentially businesses that are hoping by having somebody here, maybe less bad things will happen. There are other companies, like the one that Michael works for called Echelon, that have a much more proactive model where they have patrols around the city every night. They have neighborhood districts. So for instance, in the Pearl District, say, there might be 40 businesses that pool together their money and say, we need 24-hour security and we want to support, in many ways, this sort of private police force that is going to come and tend to our needs because the city is not capable of tending to our needs. And by the way, the city of Portland also knows that it's not capable of tending to these needs because the city of Portland itself hires tons of private security guards. This is what I wanted to write about. I learned that Echelon was a company that was very proactive. I started spending time with a lot of people in that company, trying to build trust, learning about what they do. Met a bunch of people who do this work for them, who drive around the city all day and all night, responding to businesses and people's concerns, but I would say most of the time responding to people who are in distress and whose distress is causing, first and foremost, massive health issues for them, but also issues for all of the people around them. And I rode around with a lot of these security guards. One of those days I rode around with Michael, and I think the truth of why I wanted to write about Michael is that I think, we're at a moment in this city and maybe in this country where one of the things I worry about a lot is that we're running into the ends of our empathy. And that's a really dangerous and awful thing. We talk about these things in Portland in particular, I think sometimes as problems and not about them as people. People who are in huge degrees of distress. Michael, despite seeing this distress every single day and responding to one overdose after the other, it was apparent being with him in his car that he feels it. It hurts him. He stops to pray, to gather himself. He connects with people on a personal level. I was with him, day after day in his minivan that became his patrol truck, his family minivan. I don't know how many days I rode with him. I hope he didn't keep exact count. I hope it wasn't that terrible for him. But I was probably with him for 7 or 8 days, and I would guess that every day Michael teared up a half dozen times because of what he was seeing in the city. And that is what so many of us now are missing, and I think that's what a lot of us need, and that's what made me want to be with him.
So there was so much in that response.
Yeah, are we done?
Well, the step down is really helpful, and I think actually the way, when I think about the stories you've written about Portland, San Diego, Oklahoma City, Phoenix, often what it seems like you're doing is you're trying to help us, your readers, understand forces that most of us are dimly aware of but can't really track, organizations who are working often at cross purposes through one or a few individuals and the lives they're having for those days. So I think I want to ask about the individuals for a minute. And you've just talked a little bit about Michael, and during the story you wrote about Michael's work, Michael interacts with some other people who, every one of those people also, the stories there and the way the systems and the forces interact feel just almost overwhelming. So I want to ask about that focus on individuals again, and maybe you could say a little bit about one or two of the, whether it's Phoenix or San Diego, how this is the person, and are you trying to illustrate forces, or are you really identifying the person first? What's the thinking there?
Yeah, thanks for a really great, generous question. I hope I'm trying to do both, right? I think I'm trying to write about the major forces, but for me anyway, as a reader myself of books, novels, stories, journalism, if I'm just reading about problems and not reading about people, those aren't things that live in my mind and certainly not my heart for very long. I think it's better for all of us when we think about people and what the major structural big problems in our country mean for people's lives. So the kind of journalism I do means that I'm always trying to follow these problems out to a particular person in a particular place at a particular time. And like most reporters, I'm calling and talking to tons of people. When I'm doing this story in Portland, I'm talking to people who work at all different levels of city services, departments in the city, other security companies, people at firehouses. I'm having all of these conversations, but also what I'm doing is I'm trying to spend enough time with the people that I write about so that they can start living their lives around me. And instead of just asking them things, I can listen, I can see things, I can watch them navigate the difficult issues that they're dealing with every day. Whether that means following Michael, not just for one day or talking to him just one time, but being in his minivan with him for 80 hours over the course of a week and a half to actually get to see all of these crises, all of these things play out, and to be there for long enough that I feel like I actually understand them and hopefully, better yet, feel them. Because if I don't feel them, how can I ever hope that I'm going to write a story that's going to make somebody who's never met Michael or who's never been in a part of this city feel it? I have to feel it. That's part of my job. Yeah, particularly on sort of city issues and I'd say unsheltered homelessness and fentanyl, that's been a lot of what I've done over the last year. And that has a lot of different manifestations. In terms of the people who've become the center of those stories, those all end up being people that I feel deeply for and have these like very complicated but very intimate relationships with, right? I'm not in their life as an advocate. I'm there to observe honestly what's going on and then to write about it honestly. Not from a place of judgment, but hopefully from a place of understanding. I'm trying to understand why they feel the things they do, why they think the things they do. So that's meant, one story last year I was writing about the staggering humanitarian tragedy of how many people die homeless on our streets in major cities now. In Portland, that number has escalated by more than 400% in the last 4 years. So I think last year was more than 300 people in Multnomah County die unsheltered. That's a lot of fentanyl overdoses. That's also cold exposure, heat exposure, a staggering number of people who get hit by cars because they're outside in unsafe situations. In San Diego, it used to be fairly typical that about 60 people who were homeless would die unsheltered in a given year. Last year, the number was over 900. I went to San Diego to write about that, and ended up writing about somebody named Abdul Curry, who has lived on the streets of San Diego for the last 6 years. In the months before I was there with him, his wife had died of a fentanyl overdose. He'd lost 20 people, 20 friends that he knew in the last months from overdoses, and he himself had overdosed on fentanyl and survived 6 times. And so I'm there in that situation, and I'm spending night after night, day after day with Abdul, with the people who also are huddled inside this parking garage where one Tesla after another in downtown San Diego is going past, and who are trying to figure out how to survive from one day to the next, like at that very basic level. In Phoenix, another city that is racked right now with many of these same crises, I was writing about basically how all of these issues are impacting small businesses and how they're trying to navigate them. And so eventually I ended up writing about this little mom and pop Subway shop, Joe and Debbie's Subway shop, that they had been running together for 40 years, very close to the state capitol in Phoenix. And now in the last 3 years, surrounded by an encampment that's known in Phoenix as the Zone. It's about 1,000 people within 6 square blocks living unsheltered in downtown Phoenix. And this had become the only thing that mattered every day in this little Subway shop restaurant. And while I was there, Joe felt like, our whole family savings are in this tiny little sub shop. We can't leave, we can't sell, we can't give up. And his wife, Debbie, who was experiencing PTSD going into work every day because of everything that they dealt with, was saying, I can't do this anymore. And so every day in that case, I'm with them in the sandwich shop, and then I'm across the street with the people who I'm also getting to know well, who are living and trying to survive across from that sandwich shop.
So it's interesting that in all of these cases, you're talking about cities. You're talking about people in cities, and that these challenges they're showing up in smaller places, but there's something about the bigger cities where the scale, the numbers you've given us already are staggering. And as I've been reading and rereading the pieces you've written, it's made me wonder about cities and what we can expect from them.
Yeah, great question. I think many of the things that maybe we expect from them we're not getting at this moment is what my own reporting would indicate to me. I think cities are also a little unique because we have cities that were built in ways that we don't function anymore. We have massive amounts of vacant office space and downtowns that are in the process of changing dramatically. And yet we also have housing prices that have escalated in ways that have totally changed what's affordable and what's livable for a huge number of people, right? So you put those two things together, and it creates this really difficult recipe for how to make places work. And housing affordability is a huge part of the unsheltered puzzle in a lot of these places. We're not, our capacity to house people, to even our capacity for everything is vastly below where it needs to be to get people well. Like in Portland, I would say in my reporting experience, that first step is people who are addicted to fentanyl. Do you mind if I take a moment to just describe what that's like?
I think we have to, yeah.
Okay. I've spent a lot of time, maybe not quite as much time as Michael, but probably more time than most of us here, spending day after day with people who are addicted to fentanyl. And that drug is so powerful and so corrosive. It's almost hard for me to get my head around. I mean, the average fentanyl user in Portland, this is based on data, but also just me being there every day. They're using fentanyl on average 9 to 10 times a day. It's a drug that's very, very fast acting. It sort of obliterates you, right? You feel like a lot of opioids. It makes you feel nothing, which is very appealing if you're living a life of constant physical and emotional distress. And the high wears off very quickly, and then you go into withdrawal faster than any other drug that we've known, right? So oftentimes, if you haven't used for 3 or 4 hours and you're a frequent fentanyl user, you're already experiencing serious symptoms of withdrawal. So people who are addicted to fentanyl oftentimes are buying drugs. These transactions are happening a half dozen times a day for people, right? They're getting a little bit of money, buying a little bit of drugs, getting a little bit of money, buying a little bit of drugs. And also, fentanyl rewires your brain. It gets harder and harder to get clean. If, as a fentanyl addict, living on a street of a city, you decide, I don't want to do this anymore. Somehow you have like the clarity in that moment and the desire to do all the hard things that it's going to take to get clean. In Portland, the answer is there are two walk-in detox facilities, 2 places where allegedly you're supposed to be able to go. Both of them do great work. Both of them have a lot of trouble finding staffing. There are huge staffing shortages, and both of them don't have enough beds. So, for instance, Fora Health, which is in East Portland and where I've spent some time, and has like amazing doctors and staff, but they don't have enough of them. And what they do have is people, in order to get in, so you've woken up on the street of downtown Portland, you've decided, I don't want to do this anymore. You get on a bus at 5:30 in the morning because you have to be in line at this place at 7 a.m. in order to have a good chance of getting a bed. Many of the times you make that journey and there's no space. You still don't get in it, right? And you have to go back and try again and again for the chance to go through a withdrawal that even with medical assistance is basically, doctors have told me it's like going through a pretty difficult labor. So this is the thing you are trying to get into and sign up for, and we don't have the capacity and services to make it happen right away. If you do get in, if you're lucky enough to get one of those beds, you have 2 days inside. And then because we don't have enough transitional beds and we don't have enough long-term beds, for the most part, you're discharged back to the street with a bus pass, and you're going back to a tent in a place where your life is brutal and everyone around you is using fentanyl and it's selling for 50 cents. So you're not setting anybody up for success in that situation unless the resources are there. And in most cities, not just Portland, every city that I've been in, the resources are not there to get people well, to assist them in taking care of themselves, and to get them in any kind of long-term setup that's going to work.
So to say you're not setting people up for success is a colossal understatement.
Yeah, a generous way to say it.
And
we're failing them.
And the we and the them in that sentence are both interesting. Like, I think the them there means the people that are suffering most, the people that are living on the street, the people that may be battling addiction, the people on the bottom end of the socioeconomic scale. And so I want to go back to this question about cities, but I want to ask it with a little bit more force. And I'm thinking about especially your story about Josh Askins and Chris Drake in Oklahoma City, where I feel like what you're asking in that story is a question about responsibility. Who's responsible for not only the conditions that we've inherited, but how we're going to get out of it, even down to who's responsible for Jade Wilder's health and future?
We all are, right? I mean, that's the only answer. I think, when problems are this difficult, and this goes for like unsheltered homelessness, the opioid epidemic, but it's true, I think, of every big intractable problem in our country. The border, immigration. We like to believe that solutions are simple, like, oh, you just have to do this. The truth is, these problems are difficult to solve because they're remarkably nuanced, and they require all of us to hold multiple truths at the same time, which unfortunately, in my own opinion, in the United States, we've gotten worse at that, right? We want to be sure about everything, and we want to have a firm opinion about it, and we don't want to embrace nuance. And I think solving these problems requires going from a place of like simplification to a place of complication. For instance, in cities, who's suffering, right? So I think a lot of people would say, oh, Joe and Debbie's sandwich shop, who cares? Like, the real distress is on the other side of the street. The real people who are suffering are the ones who are outside and have nowhere to go and who are overdosing, or in Phoenix, dying of heat deaths, which happens 700 times a year in Phoenix, at insane rates. That's true. Of course, the real, the absolute suffering, the worst of what a human being can experience in many ways is happening outside the sandwich shop. It's also true that for Joe and Debbie, the fact that this little business that they've built and cared for and has formed the basis for their lives, the fact that that's caving in and that customers don't go there anymore and are afraid to go there, and that there are gunshots happening across the street all the time, and that mostly what Joe does is arrive at work early now to clean human feces from this entire part of the city, that's also a disaster for Joe and Debbie, right? It's also a disaster for Phoenix as a whole. It has an entire part of the city now that people don't want to go to, where they can't fill occupancy, and these problems begin to exacerbate each other. So I think, like, rather than pointing to one thing and saying this is the victim, this is the solution, we're all in it together. These issues impact all of us in different ways, and those impacts for all of us are real. They might not be proportional, but they're real and it's true. And then I think that means we all have to invest ourselves in solving them.
So I want to go back to the theme of the series for a minute, which is fear and belonging. It feels to me like you're making an argument, and your stories are doing more than making an argument. They're sort of getting us to feel, especially the belonging side of things. But I think the daily experience, as I hear people talking around Portland, focuses a little more on fear and on Joe and Debbie's experience.
Yep. I think that's right. And that's also a little bit what I mean when I talk about, one of the things that I love about Michael is his compassion, because, it's, if we lose that, which we've lost in a lot of ways, if that disappears from the fabric of our city or any city, we're in massive trouble, right? If we start dehumanizing people who are suffering and talking about their issues just as livability issues and things that impact us, that's just a disaster for all of us, I think. So, maybe it's worth like telling a little story about my time with Michael that I think might, when you talk about fear and what's happening in a city and holding multiple truths at the same time, it was probably the most like illustrative thing I saw during our time together. On one of the days that I was with Michael, a call came in from one of the parking garages where they provide security, that there had been an attempted kidnapping of a 7-year-old child. A woman in experiencing delusions, drug-induced or otherwise, from her mental health issues, had seen a mother and daughter. This mother and daughter had driven in to go shopping for new shoes. They'd come out of a Nike store, and this woman, Jade was her name, became convinced that this 7-year-old was hers and tried to take this kid away from his mother and run away from him. And this chase, the mother, Jade, and the child all ended up in a parking garage. They called 911. 911 was backed up. Nobody was coming. They also called this private security company, Echelon. And so I got to this garage with Michael. Michael, because of the limitations of being a private security guard, could not detain Jade. He couldn't make an arrest. All he could do was kind of try to hold this really fragile situation together until police got there. In the East Precinct of Portland on this particular day, and this is fairly typical, there were 8 officers on patrol. It's a massive area dealing with a lot of things, a lot of 911 calls. There were 8 officers dealing with them. And so Michael and another Echelon security guard who was there responding are trying to keep Jade in the garage, keep the mother and the child still in the garage, even though the child is traumatized, crying, says he wants to go home. The mother does not particularly want to be standing there next to the woman who just tried to kidnap her son. Jade is looking at the ceiling, talking about things that are coming through the ceiling. Michael is offering her a cigarette to calm down. He's sitting with her. He's saying, tell me what's going on. Hey, let's sit down. Let's talk. He's trying to hold them all in place until police get there. 1 911 call, 2 911 calls, 3 911 calls. Nobody's coming. Michael's calling again. Any update? Nobody's coming. And finally, Michael just says, you know what? I'm calling the dispatch officer and asking him what's going on. And the dispatch officer answers and says, we're doing the best we can. We have to respond to calls in terms of priority. And at this point in this moment, this attempted kidnapping of the 7-year-old is not rising to the priority to get somebody there. So eventually, understandably, this 7-year-old's father arrives. In the time that it's taken anybody to come to this garage other than Michael and his partner, this 7-year-old's father has driven in from the outer suburbs of like Clackamas County and has gotten into downtown Portland and gets there and is irate, right? He's like, what is happening? How is there nobody here? His kid's crying. His kid wants to leave. And eventually, they're like, we're leaving the garage. Also at the same time, Jade, she's having all kinds of delusions. She's freaking out. She starts running out of the garage. And so Michael and his partner, at a very safe distance, telling her, don't run, don't hurt yourself, they start following behind, narrating this, slow-moving sort of walking chase through the city to 911 to try to get somebody there. In part because maybe there should be consequences for Jade, but also because she is in like a massive state of experiencing delusions, and who knows what's going to happen next. She's going to harm herself. She's going to harm somebody else. Finally, after an hour and 22 minutes and a sort of chase that goes through most of the city, Michael and his partner follow Jade as she runs into Pioneer Courthouse Square, where there's a fountain there at sort of the base of the square. Police finally arrive, and Jade jumps into the fountain. She's screaming. She says, there's blood all over the city. There's blood all over all of our hands. She's suffering like in huge ways. And Michael stands back with me, and we sort of watch. And Michael, I'll never forget, felt incredible relief in that moment. Like, okay, they got here. Something is going to happen. Like something is going to be solved. And after consulting with the other 2 police officers who were there on the scene, because of their own staffing issues, eventually the police officer comes over to Michael and says, look, we think that our presence here is escalating the situation. She's very dialed up. She's screaming. We're worried that she's going to climb on this ledge and she might do something. We also don't have the manpower at this moment to put a hold on her. That's really how a lot of these problems temporarily get solved, is that somebody is put on a mental health hold, which usually lasts 24, 48, or 72 hours, depending. The only people in Portland who can put a mental health hold on somebody are police officers. The police officers basically say, we have so many things happening in this city. There are just a very small number of us trying to deal with it. It is, her direct words were, it is not worth our time to try to put her on a mental health hold and get her somewhere. And I think like afterwards, as I, wrote down everything that I saw, as I got the body camera footage from Michael and his partner, as I spent a ton of time tracking down Jade's mother, who herself has been coming to Portland again and again and basically screaming at the top of her lungs, somebody pay attention, somebody help my daughter, somebody please. Like, she's called the police on her daughter. She's done all these other things to try to help her kid get well. And I think, like, as I process that, trying to think about who is this bad for? Like, who are the victims here is an unbelievably complicated question. The fact that that episode resulted in nothing, literally nothing, to me feels like a disaster for Jade, who is in like huge distress, who is a danger to herself and everyone else around her, and yet she goes back to a tent, an abusive relationship, meth during the night to stay awake so she doesn't get abused, fentanyl during the day, and whatever the next delusion is going to be. It's a disaster for her family that's trying to get her help. It's a disaster for Michael and his partner, who have invested energy into trying to sort of do something to make her or parts of the city safer. And it's a disaster potentially for the next 7-year-old who happens to be shopping downtown, right? It's like a multi-layered mess. So it's not one simple thing or one person, one aspect of us that is suffering. It's suffering that impacts all of us.
So I think I'm hearing in the silence of the room something that I'm feeling and something that you must fight all the time, which is a sense of these forces are overwhelming. The impacts on our communities and our people are overwhelming, and it's hard to know, first, how to make sense of it, second, what the hell to do. I think I want to ask you, like, maybe take a deep breath for a sec, because I want to ask you a kind of step back question, and that is, as you're talking about the condition of modern American cities, and it feels increasingly overwhelming, it's making me think back. It sounds like ancient Greece. It sounds like the kind of tragedy that is so large that, for example, Michael's actions rise to the level of the heroic. It would take something heroic from Jade to get out of the situation she's in, even to show up at 7, would require kind of personal heroism. So in a way, I want to ask you, maybe not now as a reporter, but sort of as a person, what's your sense of how did this become where we are?
Wow. I need to take like 6 breaths. I think the answers for how we got here are, we've touched on some of those, right? It's the pandemic. We could spend 6 hours talking about the opioid epidemic and how doctors were taught and conditioned to prescribe for pain for generations in our country and what that's led to and all these other things. I think for me, maybe the easier and slightly more hopeful thing to talk about, because you guys deserve that at this point, is like what are the things that make me feel some possibility of improvement or feel better? And the remarkable gift of my job is that in a country that is increasingly polarized in so many ways by our politics, by urban-rural divides, by socioeconomics, by all of these, still very much so by race. My job is almost like a passport to travel and spend time with people whose experience in the country is very different from my own. And it's also probably worth saying that as a journalist, I can offer them nothing, right? Nobody I write about ever gets paid for me writing about them. Sorry, Michael. Nobody that I write about ever gets to see the story that I'm writing until it's published. Because if I were to write that story about Michael and then I sent it to him and said, hey man, what do you think? I would be empowering him to be the editor of his own story. And none of us, of course, are the most fair and thoughtful editors of our own stories. So instead, all I can say to people when I go to them, when I want to write about their lives, when I want to be with them in really difficult moments is, I think this matters. I think that maybe if I can understand this, if I can see what this is like, I might be able to make other people feel what it's like. And maybe in some way that will change the way they walk through the world. And the most inspiring and best part of my job is one-on-one no matter who you are, the individual capacity to trust and to build relationships and to care about each other is still there, right? Like when we invest time in each other, relationships and trust can build really quickly. That's my whole job. I see it all the time in my job. And so, I think a lot of us have a tendency to look away. It's less painful. It's easier. And we other each other, right? That's like fear in many ways. It's easier that way. But I think if we invest time in really actually seeing and being present with people, in being present with these issues and demonstrating through what we say, but also through our listening, through our willingness to hear and be there and be present, that can build relationships that are meaningful really quickly. And those relationships, I think, are that's the foundation of everything.
So then let me ask you about Portland specifically, because you live here. And you live here with family. And the Portland we've talked about, the Portland you've been helping us see more clearly, I think, feels like a place that would be very difficult to live, to raise family. And I think for many of us here, it's also only part of Portland.
Of course.
What is it like is your relationship to Portland and to people here different because you live here than it is other cities you report on?
What a great question. And when yes, writing this story, so before I worked at the New York Times, I worked for the Washington Post. And, I've lived in Portland for a decade. I have had this very fortunate, privileged journalism job where I do these long stories. I spend, a month on every piece. I've written 2 stories in Portland in the last decade. I think some of that is because it's more painful, right? It's more personal. That makes it more painful. And certainly, being in Michael's minivan every day revealed a version of Portland to me that I thought I understood, but I didn't understand fully. And that's that stuck with me. It changes the way I move through the world. It changes how I think about the people around me. It changes how I want to parent my kids. But that's these things are all really complicated to navigate. This is a personal and small little anecdote, but it's I think the kind of conversations and debates that we have all the time. But so we have 3 kids. They're 12, 10, and 8. And my 12-year-old is a good runner. She likes to run with me. And we run a lot together on the Springwater corridor. I think probably in part because I believe so much in empathy and in trying to connect with people. When we're on the trail and somebody comes up to us and is potentially in distress or whatever else, my instinct is see them, connect, be kind. That in my own experience often works. My wife also totally rightly is you can't teach our 12-year-old daughter to stop and be kind every time somebody in distress comes up to them while they're running on the Springwater Trail. That's not good, right? That doesn't work. And that's also very true. So, I think this stuff for all of us informs how we walk through the city all the time and how we try to be thoughtful about it. And of course, when I'm seeing things that are painful here in the place where I live and the place where I choose to live again and again in a city that I love, that impacts me differently than when it's in San Diego and eventually I get on a plane and come home.
And I know you started to go towards things that, in a way, bring you some sense of hope. I was thinking about your follow-up story about Joe and Debbie. You did a kind of short update to a story that was, again, a really hard story about their business, their lives, the people living in the zone. And then just recently-ish, it sounded like there were some changes to legislation in Phoenix. The zone had kind of gone away. And I didn't get a full sense of the story of what that meant for people that were living there and that sort of thing. But what it made me want to ask about was can you point to a couple specific instances where you see meaningful progress against these forces that can sometimes feel?
Totally. And I think there's, I hope, meaningful progress underway in our city too, right? One of the things we're doing is we're investing a lot of resources in trying to help people and solve these problems. And that's, I think, a first and very necessary step. I think also, like a lot of us are waiting for those resources to bear fruit in the ways that we hope and expect that they will. But Portland just announced it's going to open again a 24-hour sobering center. We're trying to increase our bed capacity, and these solutions aren't instant. And in Portland, over the last 5 years, the city has sort of reversed some of its thinking on many things, right? Whether that's legalizing individual use of drugs, or whether that's how we feel about how many police officers we want. And in the last 2 or 3 years, the city has been pretty clear about the fact that we're trying to hire more police officers, and that takes time, and training them takes time, and there are issues there too. So I think the solutions are also underway here. But the biggest thing is, for there to be solutions, there has to be capacity for the people you're trying to help. And so in Phoenix, for a long time, Phoenix legally could not remove this encampment because it didn't have a place for people to go. And that's a very basic thing. It's like a Supreme Court decision that I think is absolutely right and ethical, is that it can't be illegal to be homeless. If somebody doesn't have a place to live, they don't have a place to live. We can't just criminalize that again and again unless we have meaningful solutions to offer them, right? So the big issue in a lot of cities, thank you, that's nice. The big issue in a lot of cities is that we're not there. We're not even close to being there, including in Multnomah County. We don't have nearly there are more than 10,000 people now who are homeless in Multnomah County, half of them unsheltered and living outside. We don't have nearly that many beds for them. So until you get to that point, you are, I think, rightfully handicapped in how you go about solving it, right? You have to scale up that capacity, and that's hard because it's housing people who haven't been housed for a long time, who are used to living outside, who might feel safer with the people that they're living with, who have underlying mental health issues and addiction issues coexisting at the same time. That's a really complicated group of people to help. That's not like, hey, here's an apartment, good luck, right? It requires resources, tending to, management all the time, and like deep empathy constantly. It's challenging. And so that's also investing in like a workforce that can do those things. And that's another way that I think Portland is trying to improve, and hopefully over time it will get better.
So you talked earlier about the challenge of editing your own story because you're biased in your own case, or you're going to see it differently. I'm thinking about all the different interests. And interest can sound like a negative word, but I don't mean it negatively. I mean all the different groups of people that have very strong feelings about the stuff you're writing about. That I assume every one of us has an opinion about Portland. And we all kind of think we know. And some of us really do. I don't put myself in that camp. But some people in here I know work very hard on this stuff. And I wonder about how that feeling of I know what needs to be done, or I see what's wrong, sits alongside what I think is the kind of empathy and connection that you're trying with your stories to build. That is, how do you see those two things going together?
I mean, to me, I guess in my own work, it's necessary to have both of those things. I don't think that I could come up with ideas for solutions, for fixes to problems, without having empathy for the people that are being affected by it, right? Like it's, and I think again, when we talk about like reflexive judgment and feeling like we know everything, oftentimes, if you suddenly pivot your perspective, if you're able to think about it outside of yourself and spending time, instead of in the subway shop with the people across the street, or instead of with the people across the street with the young up and coming person in a political office who's trying to solve it, when you switch the perspective and you're able to empathize with different people in those situations, it changes and complicates how you see the problem, which I think actually makes your solutions more difficult, but also more true and better. So, I think it's, we all learn and sort of move through the world in different ways. For me personally, empathy and like connection is central to all of it. Like that's, without that for me, I have trouble understanding things about anything. Like the thing that I connect to first is people, what they're experiencing, how they're seeing things. That's what teaches me the most.
And again, empathy seems like fear is the thing that interrupts empathy for the most part.
Totally. Fear and, fear and is a big part of it. It's also that we live now in a society where we exist in our own separate bubbles in a lot of different ways, right? And that's like the news we read, the things that we consume, the fact that like we curate our own news feeds through Facebook pages that are all confirmational and that give us the same ideas that we already have. That is also a thing that keeps us from empathizing and connecting with other people, right? So that's an intentional act. You have to work hard to try to learn about what it's like to walk through the world as somebody who's not like you. There are a lot of ways to do that, like going and spending time places where you volunteer, the people that you meet, the people that you try to have conversations with, and also the things that you read, the novels that you're drawn to, the documentaries that you want to watch that allow you in some small way to sort of inhabit somebody else's perspective of what this vast and complicated country is like. I think doing all of those things is like a very necessary democratic act.
I kind of want to bump you off your professional spot for just a minute.
Might be hard. I'm sure.
Might be hard. You feel like Portland's getting better?
Not the Blazers. No. I do feel like Portland's getting better. I think it's slow, and I think that I think it's nowhere near where I would like it to be, and probably where most of us would like it to be. But I do see signs of progress. That can be neighborhood to neighborhood. It can be like, for me, I get to see some of the progress because I go and I spend time with the few people who get into the beds at a place like Fora and see what personal individual progress looks like too, right? And also, just, I guess, as a resident of the city, I do take some comfort in the fact that we are not alone. This is, I was in San Francisco yesterday. I have a job that has me traveling a lot to a lot of different places. Oklahoma City, where I did a story last year, they have the same issues that we do in a place that's very different. And by the way, in a place where the solutions are essentially the polar opposite to the solutions that we've come up with. In Oklahoma City, I was writing about the fact that what they've done in a way that I think is highly problematic is they've decided the way to sort of like go after the fentanyl issues is they work very hard to press murder charges on anybody who not only distributes fentanyl but shares fentanyl with somebody who overdoses. So I was writing about a homeless fentanyl addict named Josh Askins who, him and his buddy had come up with $15, bought fentanyl. They'd used together. His friend had suffered an overdose. Josh tried to revive him, drove to a gas station, screamed for help, called the police. The police came, his friend died, and they arrested Josh and tried him with first-degree murder. So, this is, when you talk about the vast range of the problems are everywhere, the solutions that we're attempting have that big of a range, right? Like decriminalizing the use of fentanyl versus, charging many unsheltered, homeless fentanyl addicts with murder for trying to save friends who die, which that's a disaster. That shouldn't happen.
It is some strange consolation to say, I feel a little better because the problems aren't only here.
Totally. It's not strange to me. I also feel consoled by that.
Now, early in that comment, you talked about signs of success, and then you quickly named individuals who seem to be responding well. But I want to ask you, because you have a national perspective that few of us have, what are signs of success? How do you know in Phoenix or San Diego or Oklahoma City or Portland, okay, things aren't getting better? What are you looking at that helps you see that?
I guess I think there are a lot of answers to that question. One for me is looking at the number of people who are unsheltered and dying on the street feels to me like a very basic thing that if that's not better, things aren't better. It is not okay to live in a city or in a country where people whose lives are meaningful and have people that care about them and begun from a place of possibility, so many of those lives end like in deaths with so little dignity, and deaths where it often feels like nobody cares, right? And you know, with Michael, I was with him as we came upon overdose deaths in Portland, and you know, that is the daily business of what happens in our city. And Michael was broken by it and moved by it, but the other people who were there, essentially in talking to them, it was like Tuesday morning downtown. You know, that is what's going on. And so I think until that, if you want to just say one data point like that is that to me feels like a very basic one. We should be invested in the business of keeping people alive. That's phase one.
Are there other subtler signs to you that you recognize when you go to a place you start getting involved? Are there other very obvious measures that you want to remind us of?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say, of course, I think one of the reasons that we all feel these issues so much in Portland is because particularly our number of unsheltered people who are homeless is so high. That didn't used to be what American cities looked like, right? Homelessness has been endemic in the United States for a long time. We're at a particularly bad moment for it now, especially in the region of the country where we live. But the big thing that's changed is that it used to be that 80 to 85% of people who were homeless in the United States were indoors somewhere. They were in a shelter. They were in some kind of long-term supportive housing. Now that number in many cities is over 50% of people are living outside, where it's obviously much worse for them. It's much more dangerous. They're dying at greater rates. And to be honest, it's also much worse for us, right? All of these issues that have become foundational in what we're dealing with in Portland are in part because of so much unsheltered homelessness. So, when I go to cities where there's less of that to me does feel like a positive sign. Like if you're seeing less, it's not that the problem isn't there. Somebody being homeless and being sheltered is still something that we should work very hard to fix and deal with. But the first step oftentimes is getting people somewhere that's more safe for them and for everyone around them.
Thanks. I think this is the last question I'm going to ask before we open this mic and also invite questions from online. And it's really a question about a question you might have. And that is, as you're doing this work, I wonder, what are you most wondering about? What's a question that won't go away for you?
Oh, boy, a question that won't go away. I mean, I think this is going to be a sideways answer. But what I think about a lot in my work, and I hope like what every story that I write is about, is it's a reflection on the privilege of my job is to get to spend time honestly observing people's lives, oftentimes in moments of crisis, right? And that's, for all of you who are doing like the good, important work of trying to improve people's lives and make the city better, that like being in proximity to trauma, to hard situations, to people in distress is that can be difficult and that can be taxing, right? And for Michael, I would see for him what a toll that would take, and I know from my own work that can be taxing and that can be hard. And so I think about for myself, like, how do I balance that, right? How do I watch an NBA game? How to go for a trail run, hang out with my family? Things that just make me feel happier. The much more true thing that I think about all the time is that as a journalist, like one of the great gifts of my job is that the story ends. I leave Jade and she's still there, like in that tent dealing with what she's dealing with. I leave Abdul and more of his friends are overdosing. The true trauma, the true hardship is always on the other side. It's not mine, right? I'm so always trying to center the people that I'm writing about in whatever story that I write or whenever I talk about the work that I do. And the last thing, I'd say the greatest truth for me that I'm always reminding myself in my head with my work, and I hope it's true for some of you, is that, as taxing as it can sometimes be and as much as it can occasionally take out of me, doing this work gives me so much more than it ever takes away. Like I have the chance to go and be in places that feel meaningful and important to me, and to be with people in ways that maybe I can help them be seen. And in a country where work can mean so many vastly different things, many of them, dehumanizing or marginalizing or whatever else, like I get to do a job that, to me at least, even just for myself, even if nobody reads it, it feels meaningful. And that I think is the thing that I try to think about all the time. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. As we shift to questions, it's probably going to take a second to get over to the mic. I want to say two things. First, can we just say a big preliminary thank you to Eli?
Thank you. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
There's so much more than we could hope to fully diagnose or understand.
Well, I just told you all the problems. Just go fix them.
Yeah.
This is,
I do want to say that along those lines, a week from now, we'll have a follow-up online conversation for anyone that's interested. My colleague at Oregon Humanities, Roselle Medina, will facilitate a conversation to try to pick up on some of this stuff. Again, for anyone that's interested to sign up and join that online conversation. I also want to mention that May 22nd, out in Pendleton, the next event in this series on fear and belonging, we'll be thinking about animals, plants, and the land with fear and belonging in mind. Things like wolves and invasive species out in eastern Oregon. As we go to questions and get questions, I have a request related to our all having opinions. And the request is to just please maybe say your name and then try to pitch a question to Eli pretty quickly as a question, if you can, as we go. That's a request.
That's great. And while we're waiting, first I would just like to say thank you again to you also. Appreciate it. Yes, please. Let's go, Adam. And also, again, in the spirit of putting the attention in my work in the place where I want it, Michael, I think, is still here. I can't really see. But the security guard that I rode with all those days in Portland, it's a huge act of trust to open up your life and your vulnerabilities to a journalist and a photographer who you don't know and who you've never met. And stories like this never exist without somebody being willing to take that leap. Michael said something one day when I was with him after we'd just seen something particularly horrible, and he was sort of breaking down after calling his wife. He said, I feel like I'm trying to hold back the ocean with a piece of plywood. So Michael, if you're here, if you feel comfortable, thanks for holding the plywood. Really appreciate you.
Hi, I'm Ben from Oregon Humanities. In addition to the folks here in the theater tonight, we have a number of people watching online and a number of people watching at a screening in La Grande hosted by one of my colleagues who lives there. And the folks in La Grande have a lot of questions, many of which relate to differences between how these problems manifest in rural and urban areas. So I'd like to start with one of those, which is, how do you hear people talk about homelessness and addiction in rural places as opposed to cities? And are there barriers to covering these issues in isolated communities?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. I've written plenty about opioid addiction in particular in rural parts of the country. And I think maybe some of us are familiar with some of what that's looked like because we know where this epidemic sort of began and was worst first, which is places like rural West Virginia, rural Ohio, rural New Hampshire, places where a lot of this rose very early on. I would say one of the things that I've witnessed that's a major challenge in terms of dealing with fentanyl and the opioid epidemic in more rural parts of the country is that, to be honest, our rural health system writ large in the United States is in like a massive state of disrepair. And that's not just things like, oh, there's no walk-in fentanyl detox place. It's things like our rural hospitals are disappearing at a record rate. We have massive doctor shortages in huge parts of rural America. Doctors in rural parts of the country on average are 5 years older than doctors in urban areas, and all of our doctors are aging faster than our population is. So we're facing like huge healthcare shortages in large parts of the country, but in rural America first and foremost. And many of the best treatment to fentanyl addiction, but also to opioid addiction, is medically assisted treatment. And doctors in those places need to be able to prescribe medications that can treat opioid addiction. Like that's often opioid antagonists that are going to, keep somebody from relying on fentanyl, from using fentanyl, potentially overdosing again and again. Things like buprenorphine, things like that. And there are not nearly enough doctors to prescribe those things in rural areas. And so I've been with people who, in order to get medications that are going to help them and keep them alive, are sometimes driving 200 miles round trip 3 times a week to get the medication. The same thing is true with methadone, which, I'd say for heroin, it's sort of fallen out of favor in some ways, wasn't as widely used, but actually people have found that for fentanyl addiction, methadone is often the best treatment. And methadone is hard to get, hard to access, and still, because of restrictions federal restrictions that don't necessarily make the most sense, you often have to go to a methadone clinic to get it. If you live in a rural area, that's nearly impossible. So thank you for that question.
Is this a shy group? If you have a question, I'm going to encourage some boldness, and we'll alternate them with questions from elsewhere in the state. Thank you.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Hi, my name's Aaron.
Hey, Aaron.
My question, I work in policy here in the state, and one of the things that I hear both in the city of Portland, state of Oregon, and I think we all hear in the broader discourse nationally, is that there's such a thing as, you've touched extensively on the role of empathy in kind of our approach to these problems, but one of the things that we hear a lot in the discourse is there's too much empathy. There's such a thing as too much compassion. What's your response to that, especially as someone who's kind of seen the frontline impacts and the positive impacts that empathy can have? But yeah, what would you say to someone who says there's too much compassion, there's too much empathy?
Yeah, great question, and thanks so much for the work that you're doing. I would say that's wrong. I don't believe that there is a thing as too much compassion or too much empathy. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be incidences of enforcement or things like that. Those things can exist together, right? Like it's, my great fear for Portland, for Seattle, for these other cities is that we definitely do not have too much compassion or empathy. Like there's Seattle, I just saw recently, there was a new poll that came out, a new statistic that came out in King County, and essentially it was about the surrounding areas of Seattle, and I think it was 86% of people who live in the surrounding suburbs of Seattle are afraid to go into downtown. Like that is a disaster, right? For everything, for our democracy. So I think like the first thing we need to do is work on growing our compassion, minimizing fear to like, the theme that we're talking about, and go from there. Like, yeah. So if anybody says like there's too much compassion, I would argue with them. Thanks for asking.
Hey, I'm Rich. First of all, thank you for all your reporting and the work that you do. It's of tremendous importance, and we're all really appreciative of it.
Thanks, Rich.
My question is, when you said about the companies in the Pearl that pool their resources and they're hiring these security guards, would it be better if they pool their resources and help fund more beds and more housing and more help on that front? And is that happening anywhere around the country that you know of?
Yeah, great question. I would say and to be fair to those businesses, I think many of them are doing both, right? And actually, many of the private security companies, like the one that Michael works for, Echelon, they have a nonprofit wing that tries to connect people directly with services. But of course, I think if businesses were investing more money into actually helping the people that they believed were causing the problems for their businesses, that would be massively helpful. I also think, to be fair, that operating a business, from what I've understood, and maybe one of you does this and has much better perspective, but operating a small business in particular in downtown Portland at this moment is a really difficult and frankly, like not very profitable task, right? If you run a coffee shop, or Michael loves this little Greek restaurant called Angelina's, and we would go there all the time. It's right in Old Town, awesome food, great salads, run by Angelina, who's had this little restaurant in that spot in Portland for the last like 8 years, maybe more. And one day when we were there eating our salads, she like overheard us talking about Portland and what was going on. And she came over and she just started bawling and was like, she's paying for 2 private security contracts because of the issues that she's been dealing with. It's like, windows that are broken, but it's also insurance rates that have gone up for small businesses because of all of these things around them. And it's hugely decreased foot traffic, right? So I think, yes, places that can afford it, the more money that can go to helping the actual people, the better. But I think a lot of those places, the smaller businesses, which are often the ones that are pooling the money together, like they're not saying, hey, we're hiring our own private security fleet. They're instead saying, let's all band together and spend $300 each a month to try to get like a patrol. Those places, I think, their resources too right now are somewhat limited. Thanks for asking.
Hi, I'm Jesse. I asked this question. You're somebody that lives here but has this multi-state view, so I wonder from your perspective if what your thoughts are on how Measure 110 impacted the crisis we're facing now, and if you've had the time to look at the new changes that we're doing, not as much the recriminalization, but the programs that are being stood up with that will have any effect here.
Yeah, great question, and thank you. And I'm not a Measure 110 expert, and many in this room may know more than I do. I can say from my observed experience, one of the things that I saw playing out with Measure 110 is that the tools that somebody might have to solve a situation, Measure 110 had taken away one of those tools. And so you would sometimes have somebody, in distress who needed help, or who was doing something illegal aside from, lighting up and smoking fentanyl in like a public place downtown, and nobody felt like they could do anything about it. Like there was just no solution, right? There was no threat of enforcement, and there was no pretending on either side that this was going to be something that somebody was going to potentially get in trouble for, or even be told, you need to move, you got to do this because I saw you using this. So instead, like what it meant was that, Michael and his job, a lot of it is like kind of polite coercion. You're like building a relationship with somebody and being like, hey man, I don't mind you smoking at all. Like, you got to do what you got to do, but can you not do it in front of the ice cream shop? And like trying to sort of build rapport that way because there was no other way to go about it. So, I certainly know that from spending time with police officers in Portland and firefighters who are hugely impacted by these problems, they felt like that was not working. Like they needed more of a possibility of enforcement because it was taxing both of those staffs. I think the other thing that a lot of people feel is that we didn't necessarily get a full chance to see how things worked because we never saw the benefits of things being up and running to the capacity that they could have been to show us what it would look like with Measure 110 in place effectively. Thanks for asking about it.
Hi, my name's Mackenzie. I work at Fora Health. I work in detox.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for the work that you do.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I'm a social worker, which I think is a position that likely didn't exist or wasn't staffed when you visited. And what I run into a lot is, we're a substance use treatment provider, and our average patient needs us, and then also a housing advocate organization, and also someone to advocate and treat their mental health. And I'm wondering if you've ever seen a city or a program that's effectively implemented like a siloed approach to this issue, or you think it needs to be inherently like a wraparound approach?
Yeah, what a beautiful question, and thank you so much for the awesome work that you guys do. I think like it is one person, obviously, like you see every day. One person requires so much help, right? And so many people helping that it can sometimes feel overwhelming. There's a building in Seattle where last year I did a story about a psychiatric nurse who works with people who are chronically homeless in Seattle and also people who are experiencing different kinds of psychosis. And, because I think for a lot of good reasons, we can't always compel meds in this country. Essentially, her job was like she goes around and she nicely tries to see if people will take their injectable Haldol and see how it works. A lot of those, like in Seattle, there's one building called the Morrison. It's an old hotel in downtown Seattle, and it's only housing for people who have coexisting substance abuse and psychiatric disorders, and people who are chronically homeless. So like an insanely high needs community. And to keep they have 200 people in there, and their staff is almost as big as their residency size, right? So I think that is probably the closest model that I've seen of like, hey, this is one place where we're going to keep people inside, no matter how hard it is, and it's unspeakably hard. There was one woman in that building who, certain forms of psychosis, people, from what I understand, end up having like issues and fixations with water, and so a woman who just ran the shower nonstop all the time, causing $60,000 of damage in the building, and just so many people, so much wraparound trying to keep her in that apartment, knowing that it would be better than whatever was going to happen next. So, yeah, I'm sorry the work's so hard, but I really appreciate you doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kepper. I'm curious about your views about the chicken and the egg. So we hear that the problem is drug addiction, but I'm thinking it's a major socioeconomic shifts in this country. Is that creating drug addiction? Is drug addiction creating that? But the people that I work with are having more difficulty just supporting themselves. And you talked about the fentanyl crisis beginning in the old coal areas. I don't think that was a fluke.
Sure.
So what's happening that LeGrand and Portland and Phoenix and Oklahoma City and stuff are all experiencing the same thing? There must be some root socioeconomic changes, and what's your view of that?
Yeah, for sure. I think, first of all, you're right that economic changes are a huge part of it, right? The fact that there's so little affordable housing in so many of these cities is a huge driver of pushing people outside. And a lot of cities are, in San Diego, one of the things that they're doing, which I'm in favor of any solutions, but this one to me seems particularly sad, is just investing in a lot of sort of monitored, safe parking lot space where people can live in their cars, because there's no place that people can afford to live on their own. So in terms of the chicken, egg, like what comes first, I think that's hard to know. What I can say is that having spent a lot of time in like unsheltered homeless communities over the last year and a half, sometimes it's hard for us to talk about like addiction in homelessness, because nobody wants to say or suggest that anybody who's homeless, it's their fault because they're addicted. That is not true. I would say, though, that once somebody is homeless and living on the street, in my observed experience and spending time with people who do this work and street medicine doctors who tend to people who are living outside, it is very rare to find somebody in that situation who is not also dealing with substance abuse or mental health issues. And that chicken and egg, I don't know what comes first. And frankly, I'm not sure how much it matters. I know that if you're living outside in an unsheltered, unsafe situation and everybody around you is using drugs, I think it's very difficult in that situation to be like clean and sober and living well, right? And part of that is just safety. Again, it's dangerous to be in some of these encampments, or you're worried about somebody stealing your stuff, so you're using meth to stay alert. These things work together. And I would say from what I've seen, 80-90% of people who are living unsheltered are also dealing with drug addiction issues or mental health issues. Thank you for asking.
Hi, my name is Juliana. One of the things that I hear you saying is that we have a dearth of empathy and that we actually need empathy at scale, like we need housing and mental health services at scale. What systems or organizations are doing that effectively, maybe apart from your beautiful writing?
Oh, thank you. Gosh, what systems are effectively employing empathy? I wish that I had a good immediate answer. And I don't. That's the honest truth. I can't think of I guess this maybe gives me in my experience in Portland, to be honest, when I first contacted Echelon and first decided that I was going to write about what they were doing and ride along with Michael, I think my own preconceived notions were like, there's not going to be a lot of empathy in this. This is like a private security company that is dealing with like a city in distress. And I'm sure, that there are many people at Echelon who operate that way, and at many private security companies that operate that way. But one of the things that was surprising to me about that situation was how much empathy was baked into what they do every day. In part because interpersonal contact, it can have people running into the ends of their empathy, but it can also grow it, right? If you're around people all the time, if you get Michael, he knew the name of every single person in Old Town, right? And when you know people personally, if you're a business that is, instead of just complaining about the trash or litter or needles or people sleeping that are outside, if you know them, if you're familiar with them, if you talk to them, I do think that there's a very good chance that grows that kind of empathy. So, I guess I've seen more of it on the individual scale than on like sort of a corporate or citywide scale, but I would love to see that. So I hope it's there. Thanks for asking.
Win Wakala. I have a kind of a different perspective. I was a division manager at the Portland Police in the early 80s, and I also had a brother who was addictive and spent a lot of time in mental health institutions. And then when Reagan cut 2/3 of the beds, he ended up homeless. And I wonder, to me, that's kind of the source of our problem nowadays. And I wondered about your perspective and what you think we could do about that.
Couldn't agree more. I think that's the lack of funding, staffing, resources for people in mental health crises is a huge part of this issue. And Oregon is unfortunately at the top of that list. If you look at data, Portland funds those things, or I should say the state of Oregon funds those things at rates that are vastly insufficient. There was a story in Willamette Week last year that just, to me, felt so emblematic of some things and really seared itself in my mind. And basically, so I haven't written about it since then, so I don't know, maybe it's better. But at that point last summer, our state mental hospital is in like massive states of distress, doesn't have enough capacity, not enough staffing in Salem. And so for the most part, the only way that somebody can stay there, the only way that somebody can be in that hospital is if they've been charged with a felony and they're awaiting trial. That's the only way that you're going to be guaranteed that you've got a spot. And so Willamette Week wrote a story about one guy who, for whatever reason, because of his own issues and what he was experiencing, the only place he felt safe, the only place he felt like he was getting the care he needed was there in Salem. But he kept getting released, right? They don't have enough capacity. They kept releasing him. And so he got in the habit of he would get released, he would go into Portland, and he would commit a felony to get himself back there as quickly as possible. So in this case, when Willamette Week had written the story, he'd gone to Pioneer Courthouse Square, he'd punched a woman who was pregnant, and then gotten his ticket back to the hospital. I think like that's the fact that there are no solutions there is a huge part of these problems. The other little anecdote of that that I can think of recently from my own reporting is that in King County, we have the same problem in Portland, but in King County in Seattle, there's a very small number of people, essentially like justice of the peace officers, who can put people on a mental health hold, right? So if somebody is in immediate danger to themselves or to others, you call one of these people, the state calls one of these people, the city calls one of these people, they come, they do an evaluation, and they can put somebody on a temporary hold even against their will. So before the pandemic, the average wait time to get one of these people to come. So you've got somebody who's suicidal on a bridge, or who's like walking through downtown with a knife or a machete, and you're like, we need somebody to come and put a hold on this person. In King County, that wait time used to be 6 hours, which is insanely long for somebody who's an immediate danger to themselves or to others. At the beginning of last year, that wait time was 3 weeks. 3 weeks for them to get to somebody to try to put a hold on somebody to provide that kind of support. And in Portland, those kind of holds are also a big part of the discussion when we talk about policing and the issues the city is facing. There's, I think there have been internal debates within the city, and maybe even within Clean and Safe. And again, some of you probably know more than I do. But right now, people who work for Clean and Safe, which is something that the city has invested a lot of money into to sort of deal with people who are in crisis and to have police officers be able to focus on other things. Clean and Safe cannot put people on a hold. So I was in situations in Portland with Michael where sometimes, I remember one time very vividly in Old Town where a guy named Steven, who Michael has dealt with a lot, he had some kind of sheet on, but nothing else, was largely naked, it was a hot day, he was sunburned, having some kind of heat stroke, having some sort of delusion, and was sort of dancing and gyrating in the street in Old Town and causing, a big disruptive traffic jam in this area. And, by the time, so Michael was there, another security guard came. At one point I counted there were 12 security guards. Somebody from the mayor's office had walked down. A police officer finally drove by and was like, I'm on my way to a high priority. Like, I'll get here when I can. And Clean and Safe was there too. And they're trained in de-escalation, and they were doing everything that they could. So was Michael, offering a banana, offering water, trying to talk to him. He wasn't in a space where he could be talked to, right? And nobody was there to be able to provide that solution. So I think you're right that that's a big part of the problem.
A related question from our LeGrand, another viewer in LeGrand, is who says we need more people like Michael. What would a dedicated response team trained in overdose and social work look like? And have you encountered any examples of that in your reporting?
Yeah, I think that's the thing that we're trying to discover in the city, and Clean and Safe is an attempt at that. And I think look, de-escalation and interpersonal skills in that moment are paramount. It's a really hard situation to be trying to deal with somebody who's a very large human being who's naked and stopping traffic. And sometimes, I'm sure you all see it if you spend time downtown, and I saw it when I was down there every day. The weaponry of our streets is shocking. I'm not talking about firearms, which, that's plenty shocking in America. But I think in order to feel or be safe living unsheltered, everybody has a knife. It's like, baseball bats coiled in barbed wire. It's all kinds of things all the time, right? And so these situations turn into a tinderbox really, really quickly. And I guess from my own observed experience, I would say it's great to have people there who are trying to de-escalate the situation, but unless there's anything that they can actually do, compel somebody to do, sometimes de-escalation in and of itself, as much as I wish that would be successful, what I saw was that it was not always successful. There needs to be more capacity to also say, you know what, we got to take you somewhere. And even though that's going to take 2 or 3 people to help get you into the car and to take you to get the medical help that you need, to have you cool down for 24 hours, right now that's necessary. So I would think part of the proper response would involve that.
Looks like we have just a few last questions. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Marilyn Couch. I've lived here for 50 years. Maybe, I don't know, they're missing something. Does anybody ever talk about altering the pipeline of fentanyl? Is there nothing? Everything is about helping the people, which is great, on the street, helping people help people. But if it's 50 cents and it's everywhere, what are we doing?
Yeah, I think, so the pipeline of fentanyl, for people who don't know, for the large part, right now anyway, seems like manufactured in China, much of it comes up through Mexico into the United States. Addressing the fentanyl pipeline, I wish it were that easy. It's a massively complicated problem. So recently in maybe it started to happen in Portland, but I've been following it in San Francisco, where they're making a big effort to prosecute fentanyl dealers. Because, and again, tracing that back is hard because people aren't going up on the street and buying $200 of fentanyl, right? They're hey man, I got $2. Or, sometimes when I was in Portland, people would say, hey, I'll trade you a blue for a cigarette. This is the kind of dealing transactions we're talking about. So tracing it back to the next level, which they worked very hard to do recently in San Francisco, they were like, we're going to try to prosecute some of these bigger street level dealers. And it turned out that in San Francisco, and the same is true in Portland, many of the street level dealers in San Francisco are Hondurans who had been human trafficked by the cartel and essentially told, you stand on this corner, you owe us this much, this is what you do now. And so San Francisco's efforts to prosecute fentanyl dealers, most of the times, juries have found them not guilty because they themselves are victims of human trafficking, right? So this is like very intersectional, tied into like big issues in our country problems. So I love the idea of stopping the pipeline. Like if there were no fentanyl in Portland, we'd all be way better off. I think that also is hard. Thanks for asking. Thanks.
Hey, my name is Sarah Silke. I'm wondering, this is all super hard, and we know it is, and we know some of the solutions, but in your travels, have you been anywhere where it's been really bad and it's getting better? And how are they doing that?
Yeah, what a great question. I do think there are places where I've seen it be really bad and now see it getting better. Denver, has a relatively new mayor who essentially was elected as like a one-issue mayor, like homelessness, unsheltered homelessness. That's all I'm going to do. And not surprisingly, that mayor has fallen like wildly short of the goals of how many people he wanted to house in a given amount of time, but has gotten many more people into housing, and the city has invested massive amounts of resources into it. So I would say Denver is one place where things are still rough in stretches, but like the improvements are noticeable. And it's because that really is like the focal point of the entire city was this is the thing that matters to us, and this is the thing we're going to work on. And then I think like there's evidence of hope in a lot of things that we see nationally, like the opioid epidemic and how many people were dying of heroin overdoses in certain places has peaked and is better than it used to be. Doctors who oftentimes, like where this epidemic started was in doctors' offices where people prescribed for pain, right? And then they stopped prescribing for pain, and a lot of people went out to find similar medications on the street. And our culture medically has changed in ways that have improved that situation, and we've learned from that, and we've gotten better, and we've begun to like hold those drug companies accountable, and so all of those things are positive. They also just take time, and right now, particularly in Portland and Seattle, fentanyl like peaks and it comes in waves, and in the Pacific Northwest for the last 8 or 9 months, we've been the place in the country where it's the worst, and my guess is that also will peak and ebb. And for all of our sakes, particularly people who are using, I hope it's soon. Thanks for asking.
Why don't we call this the last question? Thank you.
Oh my gosh, there's just one person behind me.
Okay, why don't we call these the last 2 questions?
The second to last question.
Penultimate. Hi, I'm Jackie Yerby. I've lived in Portland for 25 years. I moved here from Washington, D.C., so Portland felt amazingly safe to me compared to DC, still does, even downtown where I work. I was Governor Brown's behavioral health policy advisor. I work for the ACLU. Awesome. I'm also part of Portland for All and Friends of Portland Street Response. And so I'm curious, like in all the things that you've said,
you should be in this chair.
I'm curious, like what you're, like you haven't mentioned Portland Street Response and mobile crisis. And I'm curious, like where that is in all of this.
Yeah. So does Portland Street Response have the ability to put people on holds? No.
It doesn't, and Portland Police Association has something to do with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's, Portland Street Response is also an organization that I saw on the streets all the time. And I think, Michael could correct me, was probably there in that exact same situation that I was referencing. Amazingly difficult jobs and remarkable people doing them, but also people who didn't always seem to have all the tools that they needed, right? So I guess like that's, and my sense was maybe there was some divisions within Portland Street Response too about whether they wanted that ability or not. Maybe that's changed, and now they do, and the police union does not want them to have it. Yeah, I guess that's my observed experience with Portland Street Response. I'm sorry, was that the other part of your question?
You hadn't mentioned them at all, so I'm just curious where they fit in your perspective.
Yeah,
what was going on.
I think in terms of like well-trained de-escalation, providing help on the spot to people who need it, it also has, as you know better than I do, proven to like improve some 911 call volume stuff, police response stuff. Taking these sort of like very frequent people who maybe might be calling 911 or others might be calling 911 for them several times a week. Having like dedicated response to those people and people who get to know them well and work with them again and again and get to know them and build trust with them. I think that's like a fantastic place to start. In terms of what I saw with them, it also seemed like it would have helped if they had had the ability to put somebody on a hold in some of these situations. Because often when I was there with Portland Street Response, they too end up waiting for a police officer who can finally get there. Thank you.
Mostly what we've been talking about are specific policies and programs aimed in a very immediate way. But is it possible to step back and look at what is behind this, in the sense that we live in a culture, in a country that glorifies competition, glorifies individualism, glorifies materialism. There are countries and cultures elsewhere in the world that have big cities that don't have the kinds of problems that we have. And these problems didn't just happen. They've developed over, well, decades. And solutions may require standing back and saying, where have we gone wrong? What do we teach in our schools? And I would point out that at the same time that we're doing these programs that we're talking about, we're also cutting funding and laying off teachers in every county in Oregon and in Washington. And that's going to create exactly the problems a few years down the line.
I don't know that I can say it that much better. I mean, the truth is that's, and at the root of so much of it is explosive economic inequality that continues to create a country that is wildly unjust. And that's tied in with a lot of things, with the white supremacy that's endemic to the United States, with all the ways that our power structures have favored certain people and disempowered others. But it also, right now, I think, is the fact that things, if you look at economic mobility, which I think is like a very fundamentally American thing, which was the ability of somebody who is born at a certain income level, in a certain place of poverty, to move into a better life, our economic mobility is cratering, right? We're polarizing in these awful ways. And so that, of course, is at the root of societies, for instance, like in San Diego, where I'm spending time with people who live at the edge of a parking garage where people are parking every day for $82 in their Teslas, right? That's where we are. And in many ways, that's what we have chosen to value. And so unless you decide to fundamentally go at those sort of, I think, really inherent problems with some of our values in this country, these things are really difficult to solve.
So as we move towards closing the formal program, a couple things that you said that I just want to bring back. One, you talked about Michael knowing everybody's names downtown, and that there's something implicit in that kind of recognition and development of relationship that seems to be a part of any of the solutions we're thinking about. So I want to thank both of you for that. I want to go back to your story about running on the Springwater corridor. and that the impulse to go toward rather than away is a striking impulse and one to learn from, and I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for, we haven't talked much about journalism, but the way journalism, like education and like social services, feels like these systems must go together. I want to thank you for all of that. A reminder that in a week, if you're interested in continuing this conversation, which feels like a dip into a long and complex conversation that many of us are having in lots of parts of our lives, in a week, on Wednesday, April 10th, you can sign up to do that online, whether you're here in Portland or out in LeGrand or somewhere else. There are many other ways that Oregon Humanities is trying to get people talking about these hard questions around the state, and I hope you'll continue to connect with, even consider supporting that work as part of the whole thing that we're trying to work on. For now, I hope you'll stay and talk to some people you don't know, and I hope you will join me one more time in saying a really big thank you to Eli Saslow.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.